Hi again, everyone. It has been quite a minute since I have done anything for YouTube or for Instagram or anything. It was my first year back to teaching, and so while I had some time here and there to do a couple of small things on Instagram and I was able to do my NaNoWriMo video at the end of last year, I just haven't had a lot of extra downtime, but I'm now finally on summer break and I have a backlog of videos that I want to do. And this one I have been sitting on since last summer. I've known since last July probably that I wanted to do a video on this book, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to say about it, and it did genuinely take almost a year of processing why this book has become so important to me and why it stuck with me so much, because it also wasn't my first time reading it. But today I would like to talk about John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Now, like I said, this is not the first time that I have read this book. I actually read this as a high schooler. My junior year of high school, we read this. I believe it was going into junior year. We read this over the summer for my AP Lit course, and I've always liked the story. But as I was preparing to teach again this year, I was given juniors and seniors, and I had never taught that age group before, so as I was trying to figure out what were some books that I wanted my students to read, I considered East of Eden. Didn't end up going with it, but I wanted to give it another read because that's what I read at their age. And I absolutely loved it. Didn't remember anything about it from my read in high school, so getting to come back to it as an adult was a really special experience, and it just stuck with me. And it took me so long to understand why. So this is not going to necessarily be really a book review. This is going to be more of a commentary and reflection, kind of like I did for my His Dark Materials video, because it is coming from a very personal place about my own personality type, the way that I function, the things that I believe about the world and myself, coming from a very deep place within my own worldview, and what it was about this book that spoke to me so deeply. And I think it took this year of teaching to really help me reflect on what it was that made it stand out. So I'm gonna go ahead and get into it. I'm gonna try to divide this into a few different sections. I tried to print my notes and my printer has been shutting down for the last 20 minutes because it said I had to restart it before printing anything, so oh well, we'll just do it on the phone. But my first section that I want to go over is me as a kid. So something I joke about with my husband a lot is anytime I mess up when I do something, or I do something even slightly incorrect, even if it is just a super minor mistake, I get really, not upset, but I'll, jokingly like stamp my foot and go, but I'm a good kid. Which we joke about because both of us were the older sibling. In our sibling duos, we both felt a lot of responsibility to be the good kid from a young age. Not that our siblings were bad per se, but if you are an older sibling, you know what that's like. You feel a lot of that responsibility kind of just naturally come to you. And that wasn't just as a sibling and as a daughter, it was as a student as well. I always wanted to be the good kid in class. I was very much a goody two-shoes growing up, and I am going to talk about that a little bit, but major rule follower, loved structure, loved praise from adults. Not that I necessarily sought that out, but I came from a place of wanting to be a good kid. And as I was reflecting on this, I've talked to my parents about this recently, but I remember the first, I think only time I got grounded was when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and my parents allowed me to pick my punishment. And my punishment for myself was I wasn't allowed to sleep with my favorite stuffed animal for a week, and I wasn't allowed to play outside for a week, because those were like my two favorite things in the world at that point. And we didn't even make it through the entire week, because by day like 5 or something, my parents were like, you have punished yourself enough. Please take your stuffed animal and go play outside. So I was very self-disciplined even from a young age. My mom tells me the story of when I was maybe 2 or 3, and I didn't really fuss as a kid. I didn't throw tantrums, and there was a day that I had had a lot of sugar and I was overtired and I was being kind of a brat, and I guess I came downstairs crying and said, can I just go to bed? Because I was self-aware enough to know, like, I'm just super exhausted. I know I'm behaving this way and I just need to go to sleep. So I've been that way since I was a kid, and my parents also joke, more so my mom than my dad, but joke about my Catholic guilt because they don't know where it came from, and neither do I. When I think back on the times that I was disciplined as a child, like I wasn't yelled at, my parents were always very understanding, I didn't really get in trouble for a lot, but I always had this sense of like, I'm doing something bad, or I don't want to be a bad kid, I have to be a good kid. So it comes from a place deep from within my childhood that I want to be the good kid. And that has translated into my adulthood. And so I'm now kind of working my way into me as a person. So I have looked a lot at my Enneagram type for this, and I know a lot of people don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of Enneagram types, and I don't hold it as gospel. Obviously, I know that I operate in some ways that don't necessarily align with that, but when I took the Enneagram test as a college student, so I had to be probably 20, 21 or so, I felt like there was a part of me that I had never been able to necessarily articulate very well, and this test helped me to do that. So that's why I reference it, because I do think it is an accurate description of why I am the way that I am, and it is a personality test that helped me to understand myself better, so I do think about it a lot in those terms. But I know some people, my husband included, which is why I'm adding this long caveat, calls it the Christian horoscope, because I think the Christian community has adopted it very heavily, and maybe puts a little too much stock into it sometimes, but I think it's a useful tool. All to say, I am an Enneagram 1, and if you know the Enneagram, that probably shouldn't surprise you. If you don't know the Enneagram, Enneagram 1s are known as the reformers or the moral perfectionists. I copied and pasted the definition of Enneagram 1s from the Enneagram Institute. Their definition is that 1s are conscientious and ethical with a strong sense of right and wrong. They are teachers, crusaders, and advocates for change, always striving to improve things but afraid of making a mistake. While organized, orderly, and fastidious, they try to maintain high standards, but can slip into being critical and perfectionistic. I highlighted that because it is very true. They typically have problems with resentment and impatience. Also very true for myself. At their best, they are wise, discerning, realistic, and noble. They can be morally heroic. Their basic fear is of being corrupt or evil or defective. Their basic desire is to be good, to have integrity, and to be balanced. And their key motivations are to want to be right, to strive higher and improve everything, to be consistent with their ideals, to justify themselves, to be beyond criticism so as not to be condemned by anyone. And then I added, in line with the comment that they typically have problems with resentment and impatience. If you study the Enneagram at all, you will know that there are different triads. So I fall within the gut triad. I think that's 1s, 8s, and 9s, where our main thing that we struggle with is anger, and it comes from the gut. So makes a lot of sense for me as a person. So again, I know personality types can only do so much and we should only subscribe to them so much, but I think there is a lot here that does very much apply to me and helped me to understand who I am as a person, so that's why I reference it. But that's what I've always been motivated by. I want to be, like I said, a good kid. And it's not necessarily that I feel like I have to be right about everything, even though I am critical and perfectionistic. It is not often towards anything in my environment or people around me, it's towards myself. I feel like I have to be better, strive to hold a higher standard. And I think part of it is that I feel as though because I have made myself to be a reliable, trustworthy person with integrity to the people in my life, if I fall short of that, I feel like I am betraying them and thereby also betraying myself, because if I can't have faith in that, then what am I doing? So yeah, it's not so much that like I have to be right all the time, it's that I am trying so hard to hit the mark that when I miss it, it genuinely breaks my heart. It's kind of sad, but I will jokingly tell my husband if I do mess up or if there's like an argument that we have over something small, I will tell him, I promise you no one is more disappointed in me than me. Which is maybe a sad way of looking at it, but it is how I feel, because I feel like I ought to be holding myself to this higher standard. I'm the one that's supposed to be good and perfect. I can have compassion and grace for everyone else, but not myself. That's not necessarily true. There are definitely times where I get very resentful of other people when they're not following the rules or structures. Prime example is when I am driving. I am a very angry driver. I'm not aggressive. I won't like go out of my way to chase someone down or brake check people. Like I don't try to correct the behavior around me, but I will very angrily mutter or make comments to myself in my car about other drivers being stupid, because I could never be stupid. I'm doing the right thing. It's not true. Sometimes I can be a stupid driver and I'm very aware of it, okay? I promise. Because I'm aware of my flaws and I want to be good and be better. All this to say, this framework has helped me to understand why I operate the way that I do, and it has also led to me having to become more aware of my issues with resentment and anger. Most people would not consider me an angry person, and I don't really have explosive anger. Every now and then I do, but usually it's over small things that don't matter. Another side tangent, I don't know if this story is necessary. When my husband and I were first married, I remember becoming aware of this anger, not because of him, but because when you live in close proximity to somebody in a relationship like that, it starts to become a mirror to your own bad behaviors, because I was aware of how some stuff that I did would affect him. So this is to say, not that he was making me angry, but that I was becoming more aware of my anger. And as I was working through this, I remember seeing a therapist talking about the ways that we can physically release that anger in a safe way. And her advice was like, literally go throw a temper tantrum, but do it where you're like lying on your bed and like kicking and screaming, scream into a pillow, hit something soft with something soft, just to get that physical rage out, and then you can sit with your feelings for a second. But sometimes you do have to like physically process that. And so I remember, I don't even remember what I was angry about. I think I was cleaning and something wasn't working the way that I needed to. I was just getting hangry and I was tired and it wasn't working, so I got really mad and I thought, let me apply this. And I took a pillow and I started beating up the bed with it just to like get the rage out, to like throw my own little tantrum. And in that, I ended up swinging the pillow too high and I hit and broke a light fixture over my head. And then I had to go to my husband. At that point, I broke down crying and be like, I broke the light and I'm not doing it right. And he, you know, laughed at me lovingly. It wasn't in a mean, like derisive way, very much in a, oh, poor silly Madison, like let's solve this together, it's okay. But all to say, I've become more aware of that as an adult, I think because I no longer operate within my normal structures. I've had to learn how to create my own structures in my life, but it has made me more aware of who I am as a person and where those emotions come from. All to say, I have an anger and resentment problem that I am very aware of and working on, but it is often a quieter, more seething, boiling. I hold it inside of myself and I'm not proud of it. I really struggle with the fact that I even am an angry person on the inside because I never was that really growing up. I don't know if it's because I suppressed it subconsciously, but something about coming into my own adulthood, I have started to get angry, which is not fun for me because it's an ugly feeling that I don't like. And anger can be a very healthy thing, but I think the way that I'm learning to process it has felt very much like I've regressed back to toddler phase, and I'm throwing internal tantrums like I'm a toddler, and I'm having to learn how to process that. So I promise I am getting to the book, but I want you to have context for it. And with that anger comes this incredible amount of guilt, and I've always had guilt issues. Again, my parents joked about, where does your Catholic guilt come from? Because they could correct me in the gentlest way possible, and I would like absolutely hate myself for making a mistake and sob and try to do everything in my power to fix the issue. And that brings me to a quote from East of Eden. I'm not going to quite get into my analysis of it yet or why it has mattered so much to me, but there's a quote on page 266. Lee is talking. I love Lee. He's my favorite. He says, "We gather our arms full of guilt as though it were precious stuff. It must be that we want it that way." And that made me stop and ponder, is there a reason behind my guilt? Am I carrying it on purpose because it is kind of how I operate as a person, if that makes sense? So that brings me into my perspective as a practicing Christian and as a reader, and I'm kind of combining those two because I think there's literary analysis tied up with my faith, and they kind of go together hand in hand, especially for this particular book. So I think about this, it's funny, because the Holy Scriptures of my faith are filled with people that have missed the mark. Even our Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, where the author of Hebrews goes through all these different people that were just absolute, like the standard of faith, were really messed up people that made a lot of mistakes. And so I see that as an example in the text that I ascribe my life to, right? That I get all of my wisdom from, that I hold as the like highest authority in my life. And I see these people that are messed up, that still get used by God and that are still praised for their faith. And there's something in me that still thinks, I can't be that way. I have to be the one that is good. I have to be the person that is still holding it all together and presenting myself as this perfect good person. So it's very contradictory because these scriptures that I ascribe to and that I base my life on, or that I try to base my life on, say outright, you can't be perfect. Like, that's why we needed Jesus, is because you can't be a perfect person. Nobody can. Everyone falls short. And yet I keep trying. When I was I want to say I was a junior in college, I wrote a paper on 2 Corinthians 4:7 through, I want to say it was 18. And I wrote this in the context of the idea of theodicy, which is the question of why a good God allows suffering to happen. And the whole premise of this passage is that our suffering and our flaws and our imperfections are how God is able to work through us, and they bring us closer to God. Sometimes we have to look at it that bad things happen so character growth can happen. Not that that's their purpose, but that they can be used for good things. So my paper was about that, but I've come back to the first verse of that passage over and over and over again because the image is so striking. So 2 Corinthians 4:7 says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." And I love that image of a jar of clay. I have told my husband recently that I don't think I'll ever get a tattoo, but if I were to get a tattoo, I think it would be a jar of clay with like cracks in it. To remind myself that that is what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be a vessel that is broken, but it is that particular brokenness that allows the glory and the kindness and the goodness of God to show through me. And yet I still want to be a perfect little jar. I don't want any cracks. I don't want anyone to see them. I want to fill them in with my own merit and my own striving. And that's hard for me, but I appreciate that image of the jar of clay, and I promise I'm tying it in. So the jar of clay imagery, I think, speaks to this idea that we can't be perfect, obviously. But I wanted to tie this in to my literary analysis. And so I'm looking at the idea of the archetype of the paragon and the misfit. And I have seen this commentary my whole life that paragons are annoying. And to remind us, a paragon, I have the definition here, is a person or thing viewed as a perfect model of excellence or a prime example of a particular quality. So these are your characters like Captain America that have this really like high integrity. They are seen as like the highest standard. But the narrative that I have always heard in literature is that paragons are annoying, that you don't want to read about them, that they aren't super interesting. And I've seen some pushback on that recently, which I appreciate, because that narrative bothers me, because as someone who would probably be presented as a paragon or as a Mary Sue type character in a book, it makes me sad that my character would be perceived as frustrating or annoying or boring to read about, because there is a lot of inner conflict that goes into that. So I think a lot about Fanny Price from Mansfield Park and how, and I don't think this is a common discourse anymore, but for a while it was pretty widely accepted that Fanny Price was just an annoying character and people didn't really like her, and that made me really sad because her character was very clearly in a pretty powerless position. She relied a lot on the kindness and generosity of her family that took her in. But I'm always struck by the scene, and if you've not read Mansfield Park, sorry for the spoilers ahead, but I'm struck by the scene where she tells her uncle no, she won't participate in, I think it was the play that they were doing. It's been a while since I've read it. But she tells him no, and she's doing it crying her eyes out and apologizing, but she stands her ground and says, "I don't think this is right. No." And I don't know how you could see that character as boring, because yeah, maybe she seems a little like a doormat for a lot of the book, but she has such strong character and such strong morals, and even though she is soft-spoken and gentle and very yielding, there is kind of a solid backbone within her when it comes to the right thing. So even if it means disappointing the people around her, she will say no. She'll do it crying, and she'll do it with a lot of apology still, but she will say no because she doesn't believe it's right. And I loved that about Fanny Price. So when I started to read more about people's just discourse about Mansfield Park, it made me so sad to see that they didn't like her because she wasn't like a Lizzie Bennet. She wasn't a Marianne Dashwood. She wasn't someone who was witty and quick on her feet and had a lot of self-respect. And that's something she had to learn throughout the book, but I think in more modern terms, and I think there's been more pushback on this, which I appreciate, but generally speaking, what I have seen is that there is not a lot of sympathy for those types of characters because they are too boring and their inner conflict doesn't necessarily resonate with people, but it resonates with me, and I know I am not the only Enneagram one that's out there, so I know it resonates with other people too. So you've got the paragon character, and then you've got the misfit. As a teenager and into early college, I tended to really not identify with the misfit, but it was often my favorite character. So a couple of examples that I can think of were Pippin from Lord of the Rings, and Leo Valdez from the Heroes of Olympus series. I loved them so much as a teenager and a young adult, and I think looking back on it, it's because they were so quirky and strange, yes, they didn't fit in, but I didn't necessarily resonate with the not fitting in part. I think it was the idea that they were messed up, like they were trying their absolute best to do the right thing, but they were like often in the wrong place at the wrong time, or said the wrong thing, or made the stupid mistake that had repercussions they weren't expecting, but they really were trying and it was from their best intentions, and the narrative treated them with so much compassion. And I think there was a piece of me that longed for that, to be able to be seen as messy and maybe not quite hitting the mark and still being seen from a narrative perspective with compassion and with sympathy from readers. And, you know, by extension, from other people, the real world. But this is coming from a reader's perspective and why it resonated with me personally. And this has been a lot of rambling about me as a person, so I apologize and thank you for sticking with me. I'm almost done. So, taking these ideas together. The Misfit, the Paragon, Jar of Clay, East of Eden. East of Eden resonated with me the most because of the twins, with Cal and Aaron. And I think it is because these two boys are so different, but it's like they're two sides of the same coin. They come from the same stock, obviously they're twins, we have these kind of mirrored identities. And as I was reading, I recognized as an adult that I am probably the most like Aaron. And that was very uncomfortable because Aaron made me nuts. I really disliked him. And it's because he was too good. He was too perfect. People tried to shelter him because he was such an angel and so innocent, we had to protect him. And there was something about that where he became very self-righteous and disconnected, and to the point where like he couldn't handle the idea or the reality of things being evil or being bad, to the point that it kind of led to his own demise. And that's very tragic because I think I see a lot of my own personality type in Aaron, and it was like holding up a mirror to myself and I didn't like what I saw, and that was a little unsettling. But then you have Cal. And Cal is a misfit kid, but not in the same way that these other characters that I named were, because I think the other characters that I talked about, it's just that society didn't accept them, they didn't quite fit in, but they really were trying their best. And so is Cal. But what struck me about Cal through this read-through is that he is so aware of and afraid of his own vices. He knows the cruelty he is capable of. He knows the evil that he is capable of, and he is constantly aware of it. And sometimes he leans into a little bit, well, I'm not Aaron, or we have to do it this way to protect Aaron because I'm the bad twin between us and he's the good twin. And being perfectly okay accepting that being his nature and that that was what he was capable of. And yet there was also always this sense within him of, but I want to be good. I want to try. I want to have the approval of my father and my friends, and I want to be somebody who fits in the same way. Almost like he accepted his lot as being the bad kid while being so aware of his own vices. And that hit me so deeply because the narrative has such compassion for him still. Does he make some really messed up choices? Yes. But at the same time, he approaches those consequences not with self-righteousness. He doesn't try to justify himself. It is with grief. It is with apologies. And all he wants is to be accepted and loved by his father, and that's why he makes the choices that he does. And so looking at these two pieces next to each other, think what I felt as I was reading this, as I look at Aaron and I look at Cal side by side. And Aaron is who I tend to present myself as. I resonated a little too much with the way that he presents himself in a way that made me almost frustrated with my own character. And then there's Cal, who is deeply capable of anger, of cruelty, but aware of it and wanting to do better. And when you look at these two characters as two sides of the same coin, I felt like I was looking at two sides of myself. One as the person that I strive to be, this paragon, this perfect person who is beyond criticism and beyond reproach, and then this person who is actually deeply flawed and very angry and capable of doing things that are unkind. And that has been something that I've been struggling with because I think I've recognized my capacity to be unkind in my pursuit of trying to be excellent or morally good. It makes me a little less compassionate. It makes me a little less forgiving. It makes me a little less gracious. And that's not my default. I think because I'm also very perfectionistic and people-pleasing and I don't want people to be disappointed, I try to be very forgiving, but I think internally there's a piece of me that's like, well, I wouldn't have done it that way, or yes, I guess I can let this go this time, but it's not right. And it builds that resentment, and I'm aware of how deep and how ugly that can get. And so looking at Cal, who is so aware of his vices and does give in to them, but does it with grief and with this deep, profound willingness to change and to try to be better and to mourn that nature within himself. And again, the way the narrative treats these two, where Aaron is held up as this paragon, but in a way that you start to see the downfall of that, and then Cal, who is presented as this misfit kid who is just gonna be the bad twin no matter what he does, being held up as somebody who is almost better and more admirable than his brother because he's willing to recognize his own humanity and his own flaws and try to do better. It is beautiful, and it hits me so hard because it is that permission, I think, that I try to give myself, or that I'm trying to learn to give myself, to be messy and flawed and to be aware of my own vices and my own flaws, and rather than trying to shove them down and ignore them and be perfect like Aaron does, to be more like Cal, who does give in to them sometimes and fails hard, but what matters is that he comes back from that, very much like King David in the scriptures, with genuine remorse and a willingness to repent and to do better. And this is all wrapped up in this idea at the end of the book. I mean, it's weaved throughout the book, but I think of the final scene of the word Timshel. And Timshel, according to the book, and I would actually have to research if this is true or not, but in the book it is this conversation between, I want to say it's Samuel, Adam, and Lee, but where Lee talks about how he went and he talked to these old Hebrew scholars. And when we look at the story, and I'm going to pull up the scene just to be sure. Yes, he says, after 2 years we felt that we could approach your 16 verses of the 4th chapter of Genesis. My old gentleman felt that these words were very important too. Thou shalt and do thou. And this was the gold from our mining. Thou mayest. Thou mayest rule over sin. The old gentleman smiled and nodded and felt the years were well spent. It brought them out of their Chinese shells too, and right now they are studying Greek. And then Lee goes on to say, don't you see, the American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin, and you can call sin ignorance. The King James translation makes a promise, and thou shalt, meaning that men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the word timshel, thou mayest, that gives a choice. It might be the most important word in the world. That says the way is open, that throws it right back on a man. For if thou mayest, it is also true that thou mayest not. Don't you see? And I remember that word being so important to me as a teenager too, but it hits me so much more now because it is that idea of God saying to his creation, saying to his children, yes, there is command in it, and yes, there is order, but the sense of, I'm giving you permission. I'm giving you permission to try again. And as somebody who often doesn't feel like I have that permission, or feels like I can't give myself that permission, or feels like I have to clean it all up before I try again, that simple permission of try again, thou mayest, resonates a lot more deeply with me as an adult than it did with me as a teenager. And I'm going to read a piece of the final scene too. Lee says to Adam, he did a thing, Cal. He did a thing in anger, Adam, because he thought you had rejected him. The result of his anger is that his brother and your son is dead. Then he goes on to say, Adam, give him your blessing. Don't leave him alone in his guilt. Adam, can you hear me? Give him your blessing. And the blessing that Adam gives is that same Hebrew word, timshel, thou mayest. And the parallels there, because this is kind of a modern retelling of the Cain and Abel story, the idea of Adam, obviously that name holds a lot of weight here, being able to look at his son, Cal, and tell him, you may, thou mayest, you can try again. It's not a I forgive you, it's not an I absolve you, but it is that permission to continue on, not in his sin, but in this idea that yes, he is flawed, yes, he made a mistake, and because of that mistake, his brother is dead. He is partially responsible for that, but not allowing him to just stay in his guilt, to collect it, like Lee says earlier in the book, but to be able to look at what he has done, repent, and try again. And I think this is also captured in the conversation that Lee and Abra have a little later in the book, when Abra, I think she's ended things with Aaron, or she's about to, but she got this sense, there's this needling sense that she was never going to be good enough for Aaron, even though she was a very good girl and like the best of the best, cream of the crop, most desirable, you'd want to marry this girl kind of girl. Like, she was as perfect as you could get for a young woman, but the sense of pressure that she felt from Aaron because he was so perfect, to be perfect herself. And the way Lee breaks this down for her, she says, I burned all of Aaron's letters. Lee says, did he do bad things to you? She says, no, I guess not. Lately, I never felt good enough. I always wanted to explain to him that I was not good. And Lee says, and now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good. Is that it? And she says, I guess so. Maybe that's it. And I think this is mirrored in the idea of timshel, and in this image of the jar of clay from scripture, and these two-sided coins of Aaron and Cal, and my own perfectionistic tendencies, and my issues with resentment and guilt and trying to be this perfect person, even though I know I can't be. This release and this surrender and this freedom and peace that comes from the idea of releasing perfection, because it is unattainable, and not settling for, but accepting goodness. No, you can't be perfect. Yes, you are going to mess up, but thou may try again to be good. And the idea of that is found in this book, because if you don't know the context, Cal and Aaron, their mother is not a good person, and it isn't clear necessarily who the father is. It's probably Adam, but there is some doubt about that, the father maybe being their uncle who has been long dead, but the fact that maybe they came from these two really evil people, and maybe they came from one really evil person and one person who's trying their best to be good, and that's Adam. The fact that they seem doomed to repeat the sins of their parents, and yet there is that permission of, but you don't have to. You can try again. You can be different. You can be better. Not perfect, but better. And that is why this book resonated so much with me. And it took a lot of time for me to unpack and explain that, but it's been sitting with me so much this year. And I think the closer that I get to 30 and the more that I pursue teaching and that I'm in this job, I am so aware of my shortcomings, not because I'm like failing at my job, but because I'm so aware of all the things that I don't know. Especially because I take the education of the students that I have very seriously. I don't want to lead them astray. I want to give them all the tools possible to succeed. And it makes me aware of all the tools that I don't necessarily have, or that maybe I'm a bit rusty in, or that I need to go study up on more, or things that I need to go look into at all, things that I didn't actually know. I'm so aware of what I don't know and how little I have to give. I'm aware of my finiteness more and more this year, because there's only so much I have in my little jar to be offered, and trying to pour out more than what I have just isn't possible. And it's not that I'm like bending over backwards to do my job, but recognizing I have to be okay with taking this one step at a time and it not always being perfect. If I aim for that goodness, even if it means I stumble, even if it means I mess up, taking that permission of, you are allowed to be a jar of clay in which the cracks are there and visible and present, and letting that be enough. That is what has become important to me, and what this book, this story, has reminded me of so deeply. And it took almost a year to articulate it, but that is why I think East of Eden is so important to me personally. And there's so much in here. There's so much more I could talk about this book. If you've not read it, please go read East of Eden. I think it's incredible, and there are so many beautiful, wonderful messages in this book that are gorgeously articulated, and that it is genuinely a reading experience like nothing else I have read, but it meant so much to me personally for all of those myriad reasons. And I think that's all I have to say about it. I really could talk about it so much more, but I'm going to hold it to why it mattered to me as a person. That's all from me on this score. Thank you for sitting here and listening to me ramble about myself and my issues for a very long time. I wanted to be able to give proper context as to why this book mattered so much to me. And if you feel like you've resonated at all with things that I was saying about myself, even a small piece of it, I hope that maybe you will pick up this book and that it can encourage you and help you to reflect on those things for yourself as well. But that is all for my East of Eden ramble. I have quite a few videos that I plan to do over summer break. I don't know that I will release all of them over summer break. I might keep a few held back so that I can release more consistently throughout the year, because I do miss doing this and I have been itching to make more videos again. So hopefully more from me soon, but I don't necessarily have anything specific on the horizon. But as usual, I so appreciate you being here and listening to me ramble. If this is the kind of content you like to watch, sounds like we should be friends, because if you relate at all to anything that I said, I would love to walk with you through that or to have conversation about that. But also say, if you would like to see more of this kind of content or the other kind of content that I create, you can feel free to hit subscribe below. No pressure at all, but we would love to have you around, and by we, I mean me and Samwise. Obviously, he's the better half of this channel. And if you have anything else you want to add to this conversation, I know there's a lot of things I kind of skimmed over, and there's more that I could say about each of these pieces, but as my camera says, hopefully the actual video isn't this long, but I've been talking for 40 minutes, so I need to be done. But I would love to open up the conversation in the comments, so if you have anything to add to this conversation, anything that I missed, anything you want to go deeper into, please comment below, because I would love to have a conversation with you. You should hopefully hear more from me soon, but in the meantime, happy reading, happy writing, and I will chat with you all soon.